Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
The entire recruitment process is an investment. We're using tools, technologies, and resources to determine the best employees to work for our organization that are not only qualified for the role we are hiring for, but fit culturally within our organization. But what if that framework wasn't working and you weren't able to actively hire and assess the best talent for your organization? How would you know? And what would you do and where would you begin? Today, we will be discussing the keys to creating an interview framework, philosophy, and process with my guest, Rob McIntosh. Rob is the principal advisor for Intelligent Talent Solutions, a boutique consulting advisory firm specializing in delivering optimized talent acquisition, organizational models, recruitment process improvements, and talent leadership advisory support. Hey, Rob, welcome to the Workology Podcast.
Welcome to you too. Glad to be here.
Let's talk a little bit more about your background. What is talent leadership advisory support and more about your business?
Sure. So my background, I'll give you the abridged version. I actually started off my career as a COBOL RPG programmer, then moved into enterprise software sales, then for really the last 20 years in corporate and agency recruiting roles, the majority of that being in a leadership role for companies like Microsoft, Deloitte, McKesson, and just recently I decided to try something a little different I've been passionate about, which is creating an advisory firm where I support CHROs and talent acquisition executives in large organizations and advising them how to get more optimal business outcomes.
Let's talk a little bit about our topic today and what are the biggest challenges with a recruiting team's candidate selection and assessment process that you're seeing?
I think the question itself probably leads to the answer, which is a lack of process, a lack of structures. The biggest thing that I still notice today. I've been doing this for a long time. The structure and the process is probably the biggest challenge. And I think, there's a lot of good recruiters out there that have been doing this for a long time. They know the right question to ask for the industry or the job, the jobs they're trying to hire for, and they learn over time themselves. On the hiring manager side, though, I think it's a little bit more of a challenge where they see recruiting and interviewing in a lot of cases, let's call it for what they see it, as a chore. It distracts them from the things that they probably want to spend more time doing. So I think what comes with that is they go for the easy button answers, and that's a reading an article or bringing baggage to the table to a new organization of what they think is effective. Asking questions like why are manhole cover round questions to try and determine whether or not someone's smart as a representation of performance is definitely a challenge. And I think most of our recruiting brethren continue to feel that pain and challenge today.
And that question that you're referencing is from Google's interview process. And the reality is we can't all be like Google. Thank goodness, maybe. And we don't want to have a hiring process that's like them. That question seems crazy to me personally.
Well, interesting, Jessica, that actually Google blew up using those types of questions a couple of years ago because they proved out that there was no correlation to people that could answer those questions ended up being a higher performer on the job. The same way as they blew up GPA scores and having certain academic credentials being the key criteria of what rules in and rules out candidates. So, I mean, that good for them that they sort of recognize that what they thought worked in the past clearly doesn't, and they prove that out. And I think more companies are starting to see that as well.
Well, it's good to know that Google has retired that question and maybe some of that process. I hope to never hear any recruiter ask that question ever again in any interview.
I think you'll be hoping for a while to come, though, still.
Probably, yeah. There'll be somebody tomorrow that says, hey, why can you include a list of out-of-the-box interview questions on your blog? And they're going to want that one.
Yes, we see at least one or two of those articles every couple of months.
I think I'm going to make a list of questions you shouldn't ask. Let's do that, Rob.
Yes, I'm happy to partake in that journey.
Well, so let's get back to framework and processes a little bit. It's not the most exciting topic, but it's essential to the success of your talent acquisition team and how you support the organization. Can you talk to us a little bit more about competencies as a way to create a basic framework for selection?
Sure, and I'm going to make some assumptions here because you probably have different audiences that listen into your podcast. If you historically have worked for a large organization, in most cases, not all, but most cases, those companies already have a competency model in place that's being put together by talent management and HR and the like. But let's assume for this conversation that that model does not exist, so you're literally starting from scratch. Usually what you'll find is, and it's the same as like looking at a job description, there are what you consider soft skills that are part of that job description that usually define what a hiring manager or the business determines is the key things that that person must possess in the way of skills. So the competency example, let's pick a tactical one of, let's say you're hiring customer service people that are going to sit on the phone. A competency is how does that person actually behave and what are the right behaviors that they demonstrate to actually show that they can do the job effectively. So one of the competencies for being a customer service person could be customer focus, or it could be something else along the lines of they've got to be really good at time management. So understanding what the role is and the components of that role and then defining those soft skills is sort of how you come at a standardization of what are the competencies and behaviors you expect to see in someone who's going to be successful in that role.
I think a lot of people, when it comes to competencies, or at least in my experience, they sound great, but what are the steps to establishing competencies? Is it just kind of making them up on your own, or should you engage an IO psychologist?
Yeah, good question. I think you don't need to engage an IO psychologist. The wonderful thing about the internet today, there's a lot of information out there, but also there's a lot of bad information. I think we know that there are pretty much reputable sites you can go to find out what are the core competencies that exist in businesses. There's about 30 of them. Some of them would get called slightly different things. So that's a good starting point as a baseline, is to understand, well, what are all the competencies so you're not trying to start from scratch. So when you engage an IO psychologist, usually that's in larger organizations that they want to put a lot of weight and validity behind the model that they're creating. And actually, to be fair, in a lot of cases, it's risk mitigation from the standpoint that it's defendable during an interview and an assessment process, that it's been vetted by an independent third party, so to speak, that validates that the questions and the model is sound and it's not creating, adverse or disparate impact. But, creating your own competency model is not difficult. I think the challenge is understanding the difference between good versus exceptional. And that was probably the large part of my article, is that's where the energy and effort needs to be spent, because that's how you get at a better outcome than just relying on a traditional competency-based interviewing approach, which probably a lot of people in our industry are familiar with. It's more the evidence by behaviors that they need to actually assess and create questions in a framework is really the difference I see that good organizations do versus ones that don't do it at all.
Well, let's take a bit of a reset here. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast. Today, we're talking about creating an interview and assessment framework with Rob McIntosh. And you can follow Rob on Twitter at the Rob McIntosh. That's TheRobMCINTOSH. Let's get back at it. You talked a little bit about your article, which we'll link to it in the transcript of the podcast here. It's posted on ERE, and it talks about your framework and process for interview and assessment. In the article, you talk about the differences between the current state and the future state. Why is this so critical for assessing candidates?
So I'll walk through, there's about 5 steps that anyone can do when you sort of break this down and you want to go on this journey yourself. So foundationally, the most important thing is everyone's got to understand that every organization that I've ever worked for, every hiring manager that I've ever had to support, they always say, we want to hire the best of the best, right? I want to hire the top 10 performers. But the reality is you can't fill up your whole organization with the top 10%. but you can actually do a better job of assessing what does someone who does exceptionally well in a role versus what someone does as average. So your starting point is, and there's two ways that we could look at this, right? You're a recruiter who's just trying to influence a hiring manager on this journey, or you're the head of talent acquisition and you're trying to do this for the whole organization. So I'll try and balance my answer a little bit as we go through these sort of 5 steps. So if you're an individual recruiter and you're working with a hiring manager, you sort of want to sit down and go through their, let's say, their existing job description that they're going to post and focus in on what those soft skills are. So soft skills are these competencies, right? Like how do you impact and influence, dealing with ambiguity, customer focus, realizing results. Those type of soft skills are the things that actually prove out and make out the difference more so between exceptional performance versus average performance. And people do them consistently. It's not like they do this exceptional thing once a year or twice a year. They consistently demonstrate these sort of soft skills. So you need to sit down with a hiring manager and look at a job description. And like I said in the article, I gave an example, and I'll use an example here as well. Let's say you're filling a sales role. You have to ask the hiring manager, what are the sort of skills and what are the behaviors and how do these exceptional salespeople demonstrate why they're exceptional? What do they specifically do versus ones that are just average? And you'll probably start to hear things like at a high level, they constantly exceed their goal. They are always really good at managing their desk effectively. So you're going to start teasing out in these conversations, what does exceptional behaviors and performance look like? Now, if you're going to do this at the enterprise level, right, as the head of TA, clearly you've got to do this broadly. And then I'd start suggesting other things like go and start doing a listening to or interviewing all the salespeople that are top performers in the organization and get some common themes around what does great and exceptional performance look like. But also take the time to interview and understand, well, what does average and underperforming salespeople look like? Because you need a calibration point and the difference between the two. Once you've sort of done that and defined it, then now what you can do is when you create a job description, you can infuse more of that language in your job description, obviously, because you've defined it better. Now you also now have to set basically a set of questions as you go through this, because you have to ask these questions differently than probably the traditional competency-based questions on finding what is exceptional behavior. Then the next step in that journey is once you've got the questions in place and you've set up a sort of a framework, and I'll get to scoring in a little bit, you'll also need the interview form to be simple and reflect your ability to assess exceptional performance. So the questions will reflect that. The answers that the interviewer would be looking for would reflect what are the behaviors that they're expected to hear an exceptional candidate say versus an average. And then your scoring system must also be consistent to actually denote the difference between exceptional versus average versus does not demonstrate that behavior as well. So 5 steps would be sit down, first define with your hiring manager what is the difference in their mind between exceptional and average performance. Then you actually want to create your job description related to what that exceptional performance language should look like. Then you want to create a set of behavioral-based questions around what does exceptional performance look like. You then also want to create your intake or kickoff strategy call document to reflect that as well. These are the key things we're trying to define as exceptional. And then you must have an interview form as your 5th step that basically gives the framing of the question the right way with an answer. So the expected answers you're going to hear of exceptional behaviors with a scoring system that denotes, did they demonstrate exceptional or did they not demonstrate exceptional behaviors with their answers?
I like the idea with the scoring with examples of average versus exceptional. I think sometimes it's hard for hiring managers or even recruiters to really understand.
Absolutely. That's one of the first things I learned lessons the hard way is this is definitely not a situation of you can just tell someone what to do and off they go and do it. You have to actually give hiring managers like a template, like an interviewing tool that shows them what the questions are, because it's hard for hiring managers in a lot of cases with the way they ask these traditional questions to think about framing a behavioral-based question that asks for consistent, examples of exceptional performance for that competency. It's just really difficult for them to do. They don't know how to do it. So if you give them a template that says, here are the questions, here is what you expect to hear in the answers for an exceptional performer, and here's a simple way to just tick a box that says, did they give you the answer or did they not give you the answer, as a scoring system, is key here. Learned that lesson the hard way. Tried to train them. Takes 10 times as long to train people how to do it versus just giving them a template and rules of the road.
I like this so much better than just your 1 to 5 traditional scoring system, because it's really easy for a hiring manager just to say all of those were really great, all 5s, or all these were not great, 1s. And each manager is different, or interviewer is different in terms of what they think is a great answer versus a not so great answer.
Yes, Jessica, I could not strongly recommend to anyone listening to this call, if you have a 1 to 5 scoring system today, blow it up. It's very difficult to get everyone to agree universally to what is the definition of 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. It gets very squishy, even from a legal compliance standpoint, to be defensible in some situations. The best scoring, and I've had this validated as call out in the article by an IO psychologist, they either demonstrate the proficiency or they do not demonstrate that proficiency. And the more linear you can get, solves other problems, which I've found in the past, where people on the interview loop will not to commit to a hiring decision. You'll hear things like, "Oh, hire with reservations," and that used to drive me nuts. It's either do they show proficiency or do they not show proficiency, and move on. It's also then easier to actually score and analyze the data going forward when you've got sort of that A/B tested structure in place to see who are actually better at assessing in your organization than not. If you've got this vague 1 to 5 score scale, it's really difficult to nail down proficiency.
It's great because it's keeping it simple. In its simple form, it's either yes or no. It's a great interview or no, it's not great. And then we don't go forward, or we do.
Yeah.
How can we get hiring managers more involved in the interview and selection process, other than just an interview and then a yes or no decision?
Look, to be fair, this is the hardest part about all the stuff that we've been talking about today, is changing people's behaviors and what's associated to change the behavior of a hiring manager or a business in its entirety. The best way I've found to do this in the past, and once again, it's tricky with who's listening to this call, because some people are going to be recruiters and I can't influence that, and other people are going to be talent acquisition leaders. So I'm going to try and give a broad enough response to cover the bases here. The first thing you should do if you're a TA leader is you've got to get executive leadership support on what are the business priorities here. So if the business leadership, CEO, CFO, and all the rest say, look, quality of candidate is the most important thing to us, and they clearly commit to that, now you've got something to hitch your strategy to around creating an interview framework that has to be tied back to improving the quality of people that you hire, as an example. Or another executive in another organization say, no, speed is most important to us. Well, then you've got to learn how to tie your interviewing framework strategy and the value that you get out of that back to speed to solve that business problem. Now, if you think about this as at a recruiter level, I've dealt with many hiring managers in my career, and I'll give you a couple of examples here of real stories, right, of how this pans out a little differently. I had one hiring manager who was actually a Six Sigma expert and led this Six Sigma practice. So clearly he was all about quality. And he had this idea in his head that he always wanted 10 candidates to be submitted to him by the recruiting function because that's just what he wanted. And when I sat down with him, I said, but that's really inefficient, isn't it? You have to actually interview 10 people to produce a hire. As a Six Sigma expert, you're all about waste, right, and understanding waste. What if we came up with an interview framework where you only needed 5, or we could get to an optimal 3 to 1? the moment that I sort of put it in terms of how he thinks and how he understood, I got his attention. And he started to want to talk through and, well, how do we do that, Rob? I had another executive in another organization. It was all about speed, but they just couldn't get their head around the fact that because we went through and defined all these behaviors and competencies, the first candidate that we all collectively interviewed met all of these behaviors and competencies, and everyone agreed. But her reaction was, but aren't we going to see more candidates? And I sort of brought it back to, well, hold on a sec. You say speed's important. It meets the agreed to behaviors that we've all defined. Why do we need to see another candidate? And in that example, it took a conversation for her to realize, you know what? We don't have to. We define what the exceptional behaviors are. They met that criteria based on what we agreed to. Let's just pull the trigger and move on. So I would encourage every recruiting leader and individual recruiter to try and work out what are the things that are the pain points or most important to their hiring managers or to the business, and then tie the value of this type of interview framework to help solve that problem. That's the biggest and the fastest way I've managed to, in my career, get the traction I needed to do that.
Well, I love this because I feel like you're speaking the language of the leaders and you are defining exactly what's most important for them, holding them accountable to that, but then also using a bit of psychology to help influence that change in behaviors.
Yeah, and look, to be fair, I'll be the first to say, look, you're still going to have lots of people that are just going to dig their heels in and they like their favorite questions and all the rest. I think the important part, and we just don't have enough time clearly for this discussion, I'm not suggesting this is the only type of interview framework and questions that you ask. If you still want to ask how many ping pong balls you can fit in a 747, that's totally fine to do. I'm suggesting you just need a structured interview framework that gets at the key behaviors of those soft skills that are really critical to define exceptional performance, and just be consistent and make sure they all get asked throughout the interview process. If that's 15 minutes of your 30-minute interview, great. If it's 30 of your 60-minute, just be consistent and be structured in the way you're doing it. But this is not the only questions that you should be asking. You still got to ask cultural questions, functional questions, technical questions, that they are still relevant and have a place. I'm just very strongly proposing, based off lessons learned in my own experience, you've got to start getting at the essence of what is exceptional behavior and knowing how to assess and interview for it.
Well, Rob, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people go to learn more about you and what you do?
Well, the usual suspects, right? Go check me out on LinkedIn. You gave my Twitter handle, which, just by the way, I don't use Twitter that much anymore, so shame on me. But if you go to intelligenta.com, that's my website. That's what we do. And you can read articles of this type of stuff and others that I post online.
Awesome. And you can continue the conversation here by connecting with Rob directly. Thanks, Rob, for joining us. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. This is Jessica Miller Merrill. And until next time, you can visit the newly launched and rebranded workology.com site to listen to all our previous podcast episodes. Have a great day.
Production services for the Workology Podcast with Jessica Miller Merrill provided by TotalPicture.com.